Welcome to the newest episode of Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. I'm your host, Jason Fraley, picking the brains of the top filmmakers, musicians, and artists of our time. The powerful new Hurricane Katrina documentary, Katrina Babies, is currently streaming on HBO Max. I spoke with director Edward Buckles Jr., who was just 13 years old when the devastating storm forced his family to evacuate New Orleans.
My name is Edward Buckles. I am the director, producer, and writer of Katrina Babies.
And Katrina Babies is a great, excellent new documentary. It's on HBO Max. It just dropped a week or two ago. So everyone fired up on HBO Max. It's must-watch stuff about Hurricane Katrina. Obviously, I want to go into your idea of filming the movie itself. But before we even get to that, I guess we have to say you are a Katrina baby yourself. So I guess remind us your actual experience growing up with the hurricane. And then we'll go into the movie in a minute. But set the stage with your actual, those horrific memories.
Yeah, absolutely. I was 13 years old when Hurricane Katrina, struck New Orleans, and I was one of the children that was fortunate enough to evacuate at the last second. My mom wanted to, leave New Orleans because of the fact that she had a bad feeling about the storm. Obviously, the news was going crazy, and this wasn't normal for us. Like normally we would ride out storms, which means that we would just stay in New Orleans and board up the house and get canned goods and candles, and we'll just make a thing out of it, because every year during hurricane season there's a threat that New Orleans is going to be quote unquote washed away. But we hadn't seen that since Hurricane Betsy, which wasn't even in my lifetime. So we didn't really take hurricanes seriously that much in New Orleans. One, and then also, evacuating costs, like a lot of money, So this year, my mom decided to evacuate again, which wasn't normal. And I'm glad that we did. We went up north. North of Louisiana. And it took us about 14 hours to get somewhere that would normally take us 2 hours. And
Wow.
I was coming from a neighborhood in Gretna. Which was called Time Clock. And when we left that neighborhood, a lot of people didn't leave. Like many people in that neighborhood didn't leave. So when we left, we were kind of like the outcast of the group. And we wound up having to go, to this shelter because hotels were booked up, and it was like this flea market turned shelter. And all I remember is going to sleep that night and waking up the next morning, and it was just crazy news cameras there, and a television with the news was on. And that's when I saw New Orleans underwater, and that's when I realized that this wasn't like a normal storm, and that I wasn't going home as fast as I thought that we were going home. I wound up having to go to school literally a few days later, which was wild to me, because it's just we just saw New Orleans be flooded. So going to school that soon was crazy. And so yeah, it was a pretty intense thing to experience at 13, for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. And you said your family got out, but I know your cousins and their family,
Yeah.
this beloved house that you used to go visit and hang out, and you said you
Yeah.
could still smell the rice with the gravy that your aunt would make and
Yeah.
everything. I love all those little details, by the way, in the movie. But they decided to stay behind, and it was so powerful in the movie how you say you're watching TV, and someone, you see those images, and someone else says, oh, everyone that stayed is dead, and you think they're gone, and it's powerful stuff. But talk about how scared were you for your family members that stayed behind?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a really, 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 really big family. So anytime anyone asks me where I'm from, it's always complicated, because I'm from all, I always say, I'm from all around town. Because of the fact that my parents at a very young age, we moved quote unquote across the river, because of the fact of just some it was just a new start. New Orleans was certain things that happened in the family that was traumatic, so we moved to that side. But we were the only people on that side of the river, so I spent most of my childhood in the 7th Ward and downtown and uptown. So I always say I'm from all around town. But my family, they were in the 8th Ward at the time, and I never did anything without my cousins. Everything that, I can remember before Hurricane Katrina, it was with my cousins. And, it was very, very, very odd that like my cousins were not with me during that trip, and like during that time that we were evacuating. And again, I'm not thinking anything is going to happen, to New Orleans. I'm not thinking that Hurricane Katrina is going to actually, do something bad, I'm kind of in my own little innocent world. And when I saw that, New Orleans was underwater, and like when I saw that, Circle Food Store, which was the grocery store that my family shopped at, when I saw that, that was underwater, I knew that my cousin's neighborhood was underwater. And, I'll never forget that it was this older woman. And, I asked, like, I think that was my first moment of curiosity and worry, because, I asked her, matter of fact, I just proposed the question out loud. I said, wait, if New Orleans is underwater, right? If like Circle Food Store is underwater, what about everybody who stayed, back? Like where are they? Because I didn't know anything about punching holes in the roof. I didn't know anything about, going into an attic, right? So,
Right.
and she turned to me and literally she just said, like everybody who stayed in New Orleans is dead. And when she said that, I just remember like I started crying, and like I remember like my father and my mom like yelled at her. They yelled at her so much, because like it's like, why would you tell a kid like that, like something like that, And thank God that wasn't true though. Thank God that wasn't true. They were able to get rescued after about 3 days, but it was still like a very traumatic experience.
Oh my God, yeah, and and watching it is, I mean, you mentioned, you don't even, as a kid, you can't even fathom the idea of, punching holes in attics, but I mean, just the idea of there's some I guess audio of like 911 calls with a woman saying, I'm going to drown in my attic. I mean,
Yeah,
think of that phrase. I mean,
yeah,
and talking about couches floating, and rescue boats coming into the living room. I mean, there's
yeah,
these little sound bites that just sent off alarm bells in my head, like, wow, this is not normal, and you lived through it. So I mean, I just, man, I'm just, it blows me
yeah,
away. Well, I guess
yeah.
yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and go into your inspiration for making this. What was it? And you show it a little in the movie, but what was it when you were teaching media to all those young kids, and you're hearing them interview each other, and hearing them finally being vulnerable and letting out their trauma, and realizing that none of them have talked about it? Is that what inspired you to do it, or what inspired you to?
No. I mean, that was a very pivotal moment in the journey. But I actually started making this film when I was in college.
Okay, where was that?
Dillard University in New Orleans, and I was taking a film class. Well, no, I'm sorry. I studied film, and I was taking a documentary class. And, obviously in that doc class, we watched a whole bunch of documentaries, and they proposed a question, if you ever could make a documentary, what would it be about? And, I didn't know that answer for a while. I would say that I sat on that answer for like, maybe about a year. And that's when my cousin Tina, who's in the film, she she called one holiday season, and she was just very, very emotional because Tina is still displaced. Like, Tina never returned back to New Orleans. Are her children. Well, like Daryl just returned, but like, like during their youth, they never returned. And she called, and she wanted to speak with everybody because it was a holiday, and I guess she was feeling lonely. And when it was my turn to speak with her, she brought up the fact that, she heard that I was into film and into theater. And she was like, one day I'm gonna let you read my diary, and, and make a movie about me. And, I thought that she was joking. And so she and I kind of like, stayed on the phone and talked a little bit. And like, that's when she, began to open up about what happened during Hurricane Katrina. And, she opened up about, some heavy and deep things that she and her children experienced. And as soon as she told me what she and her children experienced, it made me think about growing up in a post-Katrina New Orleans, which was really, really bad. It was violent. It just wasn't a place for like a kid to grow up healthy, right? It was violent, and the craziest part is I felt that like the adults and the press and the local government, they were blaming like the kids for how that trauma was surfacing. So when she told me that story about what, what she and the kids experienced, something clicked, and it made me want to draw parallels between that state of New Orleans and what she told me her children had experienced in Hurricane Katrina, and what I had experienced, from Hurricane Katrina. And like it really just made me, want to look at that and like propose a question, how does that type of trauma impact the kid? And what happens, what, if that kid doesn't get that trauma out appropriately. So like that was my first, approach to the documentary. Once I started to teach high school and once I started to interview more, of my peers, that's when the journey became more validating. And like that's when, it became more complex, because I started to learn things about like PTSD and anxiety. And, through my students, I learned about fight or flight and, just like really how sad they were, So, every piece of the journey, from me starting in film school, to me graduating and then becoming a media teacher, to me interviewing my family and, my peers, it all served its own purpose. And, I kind of made this thing on like a shoestring budget. I didn't have any funding, really. And, I just used like, one camera and a small Zoom handy recorder. And, I just led with story. And, that's kind of what, got us here, is the fact that, this story is just something that is powerful. It needs to be heard. It's important that the children of New Orleans and the young people who experience Hurricane Katrina are owning their narratives again. So, it's been a long journey, but I'm definitely glad that we're here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I love what you're saying. I mean that the fight or flight trauma that's just been held up in so like a whole generation of kids that are now adults, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That is such a good core message and a through line in the documentary, in the movie. That makes your Katrina Babies movie, it makes it unique, because obviously Hurricane Katrina's been covered to death, like Spike Lee
Yes.
did the When the Levees Broke, Requiem in Four
Yeah.
Act, one of the
Yeah.
maybe this definitive thing on it, but that came out like a year after. That was in like '06. So what makes
Yeah.
Katrina Babies cool and unique compared to that and all the other ones since is this through line of the babies, Katrina Babies in the title. It's that
Yeah.
you've been living with this inside of you, and finally it's some of them break down in tears, finally getting to say, and you yourself, like interviewing yourself. That's
Yeah.
what makes it powerful to me. Did you like sense like almost like a relief or this release when you're filming these people, including yourself, like, oh my God, I finally am able to talk about this?
Yes. Well, honestly, I didn't understand the weight. I didn't understand what I I didn't really understand what I was really signing myself up for when I first, started to make this film. I
Right.
was this young, I got this idea when I was 20. I physically started working on this project when I was 23, right? And I finished it when I was 30. So I spent all of my 20s working on this project. So,
Mhm.
like imagine being 20 again and you're trying to navigate life and
Yeah.
and and like you're super immature. Now add that to
Yeah.
also trying to carry something as heavy as Katrina and
Right.
carry like a entire city. I didn't realize what I was carrying, and it wasn't until I interviewed the first group of people from the community that I realized that wow, this is really some heavy stuff. And when Maisha Williams, who is one of my closest friends, and she's the first person in the documentary to say, I've never talked about this stuff before because no one ever asked me.
Mhm.
That was new to me. I didn't realize that, that was one of the through lines in this film, that like most of the young people of Hurricane Katrina never spoke about this. I knew that I never spoke about it, but I didn't realize that it was a whole community of people who had never been asked simply, "How are you doing after Hurricane Katrina? How are you feeling after Hurricane Katrina?" And when I realized that, it was a very validating moment in my journey, because I realized this story does matter. This story is important because I'm not just putting light on the story. I'm actually starting a process to, getting something out and possibly healing. So yes, there was a release once I realized that, these were not just interviews; these were almost like therapy, right? Like I've had certain people literally tell me, man, like that just felt like a therapy session. I didn't even realize that I had all of that stuff bottled in, and obviously, hearing all of those stories and talking to my peers and my students, it allowed me to recognize my own trauma. It allowed me to recognize the fact that I was also in a similar space when it came to how I was, suppressing my trauma. And I think that what's been beautiful about this film and like what it's doing, for the community is that it's finally starting a conversation amongst us all, and it's starting some type of pathway to healing, and that's just really exciting.
Oh yeah, pathway to healing is what this is all about.
Yeah.
And speaking of that healing, it's almost like, how do I say, almost like multi-pronged, because I mean a lot of people, nationwide, worldwide will remember the horrific images of the actual floodwaters and people trapped on the roofs, etc., airlift out and helicopters, etc. But a lot of them might not know, and I want you to remind them that there were almost several chapters of trauma that happened after that. For instance, getting all evacuees all gathered in these mass areas. You mentioned like a converted flea market. There's some people that look like they're in a Domino's pizza. Of course, the
Yeah.
the Superdome, the New Orleans Saints Stadium, packed to capacity. One person calls it like concentration camp style.
Yeah.
I mean that's how crazy jam packed everyone is. People are dying and can't get
Yeah.
their insulin, etc. And then beyond that,
Yeah.
people forced to live in these trailers that you find out that, what was it, formaldehyde or something? There's a
Yes.
chemical, and they're growing tumors in their belly. And then you see the
Yep.
scars on the woman's I mean, man,
Yeah. Not
talk about,
just,
remind them that it
yeah.
wasn't just hurricane winds and water. It's the way
Yeah.
that the society, and the government, state, local, federal, like really just kind of left people out
Yes.
to dry.
Yes. State, local, and federal. I mean, it's I always say, yes, Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster. And that's arguable because, if we're talking about climate, maybe, maybe it's not, natural, but, like in simple terms, I always say that Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster, but the way that it was handled, the actual recovery, it was not natural at all. It was very unnatural. And like, it was very criminal, when you speak about Damaris, Damaris is the young woman who stayed in a FEMA trailer that was filled with formaldehyde, and you know, that's one of the poisons that's used to, embalm, dead bodies, right? And what's even crazier is the only reason that she stayed in that trailer is because of the fact that there was a news announcement that New Orleans was open, that like New Orleans was ready for us to come back. So when she heard that, she's a student and she wants to finish school. So she comes back to New Orleans and they set her up with a trailer that she didn't know was filled with poison. And
Mm.
a few months later, she realized that a tumor was growing, in her belly. And that's when she realized that it was cancer. And since then, she's had like 3 different forms of cancer, diabetes, and it's all linked to the FEMA trailer. And there's a whole community of people who lived in these trailers. The only thing is FEMA gave away some hush money, so many of them can't speak about it. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, and like, this is something that's still very present. I mean, just to be honest, Damaris, she came to Tribeca, and when she came to Tribeca, she showed me her legs, and there were 2 new lumps on her leg. So, and like, Tribeca was 5 months ago. So this stuff is still impacting us. Like, yes, the floodwaters are gone, but the impact of Katrina is very present. When you look at, just like how many of these children are not just mentally and emotionally impacted, but people are physically impacted. Like, trauma wears on the body, stress wears on the body, and I think that like Damaris is an example of like, like explicitly how, just like the mishandling of this situation, and the greed for the economy and tourism to come back led to, someone being hurt, So
And
yes,
gentrification and all that comes with
yeah.
that.
Well, I mean, gentrification is a whole different thing because of the fact that what's happening with gentrification in New Orleans is, first of all, people like Tina, my cousin, couldn't move back because rent is just entirely too high. Her house that, like a lot of people in New Orleans rent, Black people rent. So, her house that once cost, it was like, I think her house was worth about $38,000, like maybe like 38 to $42,000 before Hurricane Katrina. I just got that house priced. That house is worth about $800,000 now.
Oh my, that's
So
ridiculous.
yes. So like imagine what rent would be like on that place. You know what I'm saying? So a lot. First of all, people couldn't come back, so they were displaced. Now we also have to pair that with the fact that people who could come back are being displaced inside of New Orleans. So we have natives who have been here all of our lives who can't afford to live in our neighborhoods that we grew up in, who can't afford to live in, in the neighborhoods where our identity comes from. So, a lot of neighborhoods are being combined into one community. And, New Orleans is a very territorial place. It's neighborhoods are rivals, so when you put them all in one place, what do you think is going to happen? So it's a lot of violence going on. And also, people are just scattered, there's a big identity crisis that's happening in New Orleans because of gentrification. So, people always, want to talk about, how a place being gentrified is, a coffee shop coming, right? Or it's a Whole Foods being built. But it's not just that. It can lead to things like violence. It can lead, to things like, identity crisis. It impacts the human more than just not being able to afford, these $5, coffee. It's deeper. So that's how New Orleans is being impacted, just in like a few ways, from things like, gentrification.
Yeah, displaced in your own city. It's weird to say
Yeah,
that, but you are. And not to mention folks and families that were for that once they evacuated, they ended up settling in other places like Dallas or Mississippi, and they're being called refugees, and violent crimes are a higher percentage against them than normally would be.
yeah,
Like you have all these really powerful telling details in the doc. And talk about we've mentioned FEMA a couple times, and just to remind
yeah.
everyone, that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Talk about how it became, the footage, and you show the Kanye West clip in there, the famous clip.
Yeah,
I still, every time I see Mike Myers' reaction, but it's
it's hilarious, right?
it's hilarious, but also like hilarious. So you gotta laugh so you don't cry, kind of a thing
Yeah,
with the
yeah. It's a
situation.
nervous laugh.
Yeah, but talk about how it became such a a politically divisive, racially divisive topic, and yeah, maybe Kanye could have used different words or whatever, but I mean there's a core truth that we were getting at with. I remember, God, I think I was in college. You remember hearing President Bush saying, "Oh, you're doing a heck of a job, Brownie, down there," but really
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
like
yeah.
seeing these images and it just didn't add up. But talk a little bit about how Katrina became a window into the contrast of race in America.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the Kanye moment is a perfect place to start with that. I mean, I think that Kanye West, he I thought that he used the perfect word, I think that when Kanye West said that George Bush didn't care about, Black people, I don't think that he was only talking about George Bush. I think that he was talking about, America. I think that he was talking about, our government, and like, I think that it was warranted. I mean, when you look at the news, it was Black people in New Orleans, like, on the streets, dead and alive, days after Hurricane Katrina, and starving, hot, no power, like no water. And, when you look at that footage and then you see George Bush flying over New Orleans, in the plane, just looking down, like, for a photo op, and some of his staff are shoe shopping, like, and like, it's just like, where are like the priorities, right? Like, it's so, I don't think that he was only talking about George Bush, but I think that anybody who was in that position would have been spoken about, like, in the same way, like, if it was the same response, So yes, like, George Bush was, the head of our country, and it's just like, there should have been a faster response. So, if you want to prove that statement wrong, you would have done better. You know what I'm saying? So, and that was like, one of the first moments, that I really realized that Hurricane Katrina was not just a natural disaster, but it was about race. It was about resource allocation, right? Again, at 13 years old, growing up in a city as Black as New Orleans, I'm innocent, right? I'm kind of naive to, like, racism, in a sense, like, not because I didn't think that it existed, but because I was around all Black people. I wasn't really around white people, to even really, experience racism like that, like, because, like, I was around my people, my neighborhoods were Black, so that was like the first time that, like, like, I really realized, I'm like, yo, like, this storm is not just a storm. It's actually because we are disenfranchised and Black that we are getting this slow response, to help and, like, to government assistance. It's the reason that we're being called refugees. Kanye said something else in that moment. Like, he said something that, like, really stuck with me. He said that Black people always receive the slowest help possible. And, he also said that, if you see a white family, you say that they're looking for food, but if you see a Black family, you know, you say that they're looting. And it's just like, that was true. It's like, when it came to white families, like, going into stores and grabbing food, they were doing, like, what they had to do, to survive, right? But
all those poor families, they're really scraping by,
yeah,
and
yeah, exactly. And like, when you saw Black families, it was criminals, and they're still in, one of the craziest moments, and like, I was watching some archival footage while I was editing this film. Well, while me and my editor was editing this film, and there's this clip of this grocery store, and it's surrounded by water, right? It's surrounded by water, and this guy, he goes into the grocery store, and he steals an air mattress, right? And the conversation that the news wanted to have was him stealing the air mattress, but no one's acknowledging the fact that he's surrounded by water.
He's trying to float on it, probably.
He's trying to float. And, like, I'm like, that is the problem with America, is that, when you're Black and disenfranchised, you can be surrounded by water, with, your life at stake. But the problem is you stole something so that you can float and, like, survive, and that's a moment that, like, I really wish I could have kept in the film, but it wasn't working exactly how we wanted to. But yeah, like, that's it was just, like, insane to see. And, like, not to even mention us being called refugees, like, how many times we were called refugees is crazy, because by definition, if you put out your Webster's dictionary, we are not refugees, so that was insane, like, we were being treated like we were not from this country. We were being treated like we weren't Americans, but, I think that to call us refugees was irresponsible and lazy.
Oh, absolutely. And like you're saying, it's well, and first of all, Webster, I mean, we that's an old white guy, even in the name,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? So we're
yeah,
talking about deep institutional stuff
yeah,
that Hurricane Katrina pretty much, how do I say it? It was like a wound that was already there that just got
yep,
ripped open and shined a spotlight on as like a
exacerbated,
prime
yeah,
example of what has existed, and hopefully what we were trying to learn from. I don't know. I don't know how
yeah.
much farther we've actually come. Maybe a little, maybe not.
I'll say we didn't come that far at all. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look, like, I'm sure that you're hearing about what's happening in Mississippi right now.
Yeah.
If you look at what's,
Water.
like, yeah, the water crisis in Mississippi, what happened in Flint, so many other things. I mean, I think that us sitting here in the middle of a pandemic, it's like, how are we thinking about her, like, what happened during Hurricane Katrina and like what can possibly happen here? My good friend Sierra always says, the reason that this story of Hurricane Katrina is so important to look back at now is because this can be in your backyard. This can be in all of our backyards today with everything that's going on, specifically the pandemic. It's in Mississippi's backyard right now because of like the slow government response. And like, I don't think that it's a coincidence that, it's a lot of disenfranchised Black people in Mississippi, So, yeah, I think that the story of New Orleans and like what they experienced during Hurricane Katrina, it's a very American story.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even up here in Washington, D.C., I mean, the gentrification, and that's every city. I mean, yeah, it can relate to everybody everywhere watching this. Well, we won't keep you much longer, but real quick, I do want to go into a little bit of the filmmaking, peel back the curtain on the filmmaking side. Tell me about, the decision to kind of show you in, I don't know if it's Final Cut or Adobe Premiere, but watching you editing it, that was kind of cool to like film yourself, with the editing footage and scrubbing back and forth, and also getting the cool animation, to be able to, you're probably sitting there saying, I have all these interviews, how am I going to sort of tie it together? And the animation is kind of a perfect way to do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We knew very early on that, this film was also about me making the film. Me being in front of this story again, me carrying all of this weight and trauma of a whole community, me carrying the weight of New Orleans, me carrying the weight of I'm sorry, of Hurricane Katrina. It was important for us to figure out, how do we show that, how do we visualize that? And it was when I started going through the archival, that was one of the toughest things that I've had to do in this process, other than listening to the, traumatic stories of my peers and my family. Going through the archival footage, like taking a look back at all of that stuff and like hours and hours and hours of footage, it was so tough. And I knew that, just like my, community of, people I interviewed was bold and like, had enough courage to be vulnerable for this project so that we can get the story out. I knew that, I wanted to be vulnerable enough to show how that footage was impacting me. So, we just came up with the idea to film me going through the archival, film my reactions, as verite, as I'm watching all this footage, deciding what needs to go into the documentary, as I'm, I guess like discovering new things and like doing my research, I wanted to film that because this project is so personal to me. What I learned is that every time I'm going through that footage, every time I'm interviewing somebody, like, about, the trauma that they experienced during Hurricane Katrina, I too was experiencing secondary trauma. And that's just something that, we wanted to show. And we thought that could be a powerful way to show it. How is Buck? That's me. My nickname is Buck. So like, it was just like, how, like a question throughout this whole editing process was, how is Buck? How is Buck being impacted? How is Buck doing while making this film? And we knew that can be a strong storyline, like, in this project. As far as animation goes, my mentor, Chike Oza, he's one half of Cootie and Chike, and they just came out, with the movie Genius about Kanye West. And, they are my producers and mentors on this project. Well, mentors like just in real life, but producers on this project. And Chike is from New Orleans, and Chike kind of exposed me to fine art and Black art and even animation. He and Cootie uses a lot of animation, in their project. So I always thought that was cool. So a few years ago, Shika and I were talking about the idea of using animation in Katrina Babies, because of the fact that, this stuff is so heavy, and we know that animation, it can kind of create this vulnerability and this empathy for a viewer while watching it. It makes them a little bit more receptive to like what they're hearing, and we knew that that was going to be important when telling these stories. We knew that we couldn't just keep using all of this harsh archival footage in every moment of the film. We didn't want to do that to our viewers. We didn't want to do that to the actual survivors, of Hurricane Katrina. So we thought that animation could be a strong, powerful way, to create that personal feel. Because like also a lot of the stuff we don't have footage for, people weren't just carrying cameras like some people were, but people weren't just filming Hurricane Katrina. So, animation worked in multiple ways.
And before cell phones or before camera phones,
yeah,
really, smartphones, I should say.
Yeah. Like there was really no social media then either. So like people weren't just documenting this stuff, Mm-hmm. And we also knew that we wanted to use a collage style, of art, like, using real pictures and like putting it over, animation. Like we knew that can be dope, like, borrowing inspiration from people like Jacob Lawrence and Deborah Roberts. We knew
that moved that doc last year. What was it? Flea used animation the whole time. It can work really well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, exactly. And we actually used real photos of the people who we made animated characters for. So like, when you see my cousin Tina as an animated character, the photo that's smacked on top of the animation is a real photo of her. So it just makes it that much more personal and emotional. And I'm very proud of how the animation came out. I thought that was something really cool, to be able to do as a first-time feature filmmaker.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah, so
thank you so much for making such a great movie. Again, everyone, it's called Katrina Babies on HBO Max. Thank you so much for joining us and documenting all this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. Our theme music is Scott Buckley's Clarion. Remember to give us a 5-star rating if you like what you hear. We'll see you next time. I wanted to take a second to tell you about an app I really enjoy. Living in the DC area is great, and Podcast DC gathers all of the local shows that I like all in one local app. Health, sports, local news, politics, and so much more. Podcast DC is the new local app with hundreds of DC area podcasts to choose from. I can earn exciting rewards just for listening and share the podcasts I love instantly. Available in the App Store or in Google Play, listen local with Podcast DC.